In this video, I'm going to talk about something a little different. Usually I try focus on how to get more out of GW skirmish games, but a recent comment made me realize that new players don't always understand why Warhammer is so popular. I think the common assumption is that GW makes good games and great miniatures, but you can get better miniatures and there definitely are better rule sets out there. So today I'm going to talk about why players like me are big Warhammer fans, whether that be 40k, Age of Sigmar, or the Old World, and also how Warhammer and Games Workshop are not the same thing, even though we often confuse the hobby and the company. To understand why Warhammer is so popular, we need to go back to the start of Games Workshop. Initially, it was just a couple of friends playing Dungeons & Dragons in the late 70s. They actually managed to get their start as the UK distributor for D&D, and when they lost that license, they went in their own direction. So initially we got Warhammer and later Warhammer 40k. Warhammer has been around for nearly 50 years now, so many fans have grown up with it. Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40k are their own unique and well-developed settings, but they weren't always that way. Throughout the decades, they've slowly added layers, increasing in depth and in complexity. Those layers were often ripped wholesale from popular media at the time. This means the settings are layered with tropes and popular media that many of us have grown up with. HeroQuest came out in 1989, and Space Crusade came out soon after in 1990. These were made in collaboration between GW and Milton Bradley. These boxes were very influential if you were growing up around that time, and the dream of having a fully painted set was real enough that it still lives on for many of us. Of course, now we're a bit older, this is something we can actually achieve. Personally, I have a fully painted Space Hulk and a fully painted Curse City box, which could be seen as the modern versions of Space Crusade and HeroQuest. To follow on from that, White Dwarf magazine was available in newsagents when I was young. So I had seen the board games, and when I wanted to know more, I was able to pick up this magazine. In it, there were all these fantastic looking miniatures, laid out with their classic goblin green bases and heavy metal style paint schemes. This easy access meant GW became a well-known brand, at least in the markets where you could pick up a White Dwarf. That went up a step with the release of the Lord of the Rings game, and more specifically with the weekly Battle Games magazine that came along with models. The first pack was an absolute bargain, and if you stuck with it, you got to build a pretty amazing collection. Obviously, at the time, Lord of the Rings was a particularly hot license, so this brought in a lot of new players. Over the years, we've also seen some pretty amazing computer games get released. There have been some pretty horrible duds, it has to be said, but games like Dawn of War were such great games in their own right that people who'd never heard of Games Workshop were playing them. This again increased the awareness of the brand and the hobby, even if many didn't make the jump from computer to tabletop. Black Library was founded in 1997. Initially they were focused on short stories for the Inferno magazine, but after time it really kicked off into a serious publishing house with a collection of really amazing authors. While I suspect this was initially directed at existing fans, there are now plenty of fans who have never picked up a paintbrush but eagerly wait the next book in their favourite series. Okay, so we've talked about some history and lots of entry points into the game. There are newer entryways that I've probably missed because, well, they weren't that relevant to me. The key point here I'm trying to make is that for many of us, Warhammer has been around all of our lives. If we've not been active in the hobby, then it's been at least background noise. It's simultaneously something familiar that reminds us of our childhood and something lasting that we expect to still be around in 10, 20 years' time. So that's some history and how GW got its hooks into you. Next up, I want to look at the hobby, what the various aspects are, and why they seem particularly relevant to life today. Opinions will differ on what exactly counts as the hobby, but for me I think there are three core elements. The part GW love, or spending money, which I do feel deserves its own place. Then you have the assembly and painting of models, and finally actually playing games. You can enjoy Warhammer however you want. If you never buy a single model, never paint anything, and aren't interested in throwing dice, but you're still a fan, that's awesome. Lots of people enjoy Warhammer in their own way. My wife, for example, is a massive fan of the lore, and Warhammer cosplay, which is why our house has a full-size bolt gun and a worrying number of skulls. That said, I do want to focus on these three elements, so purchasing, painting and playing, as I feel these are particularly relevant to modern life. At some point I'll do a video about how to Warhammer responsibly, because Games Workshop really works extra hard at separating us from our money. The hobby is expensive. Everything is super hyped all the time, and the limited releases really play on that fear of missing out. That said, if you're working your 9 to 5, you paid all your bills, and you have a little left over just for yourself, then picking up something from GW is a good endorphin rush. It's no different to collecting stamps or any similar hobby. It might end up sitting on a shelf for a few years before you get around to it, but if you have the money to spend, you enjoy buying Warhammer, and do so responsibly, then there's really no harm. Next is the assembly and painting, something that many would consider the main part of the hobby. For me, there are a couple of key aspects of this. The first is that it's a creative task that I can really focus on. That ticks a couple of boxes for me. I get a way to express myself, and I also get some time where I can put away the stress of work and life and just focus on miniatures. The idea of mindfulness is common enough these days, but actually sitting down to work on some miniatures really is one of the best practical expressions of it. Everything else becomes secondary, and we just focus on the model in front of us. Another aspect I quite like about this part of the hobby is we can fit it in to our schedule however we want. If you've got responsibilities, work, school, kids, whatever, hobby will wait until you're free, and then it's there for you when you need it. You often hear parents who use it as a way to unwind with maybe 30 minutes or so of hobby after the kids have gone to bed. You get to do it at your own pace, which is a refreshing change from the go, go, go attitude common in modern life. You also get a chance to improve and grow, and at the end of it, you've got something to show. It doesn't really matter how good you are, a model with colours on it is always going to be better than one without. The third pillar in my example is actually playing the game. So, putting aside whether the game is any good or not, it is a nice excuse for social activity. Maybe that's meeting up with a mate, or it could mean getting to know new players at your local store. As a grown-up, having an excuse to meet with friends can be tricky, and getting to know new people is often a challenge. Playing a game is a great way to work around that, and I get to meet with my mate, talk about some Warhammer, and roll some dice. Honestly, it's something I really look forward to. As an added bonus, if the game is good, which honestly I'd hope it is, then it makes for a nice intellectual challenge, and hopefully a great story at the end. As a brief aside, because Warhammer is an almost common language, I can happily chat away with someone I've met for the first time if I know we're both interested in Warhammer. That makes for a great way to connect. It also allows for something that is called a parasocial connection. So in the image here we have Nick, Wade, Ben and Peachy. When the pandemic kicked off, Warhammer had a big surge. Most of people put that down to the hobby being something that you can happily do at home, but for me it was the daily Twitch streams. At the end of the workday, each day, I put it on TV, and this was a big chunk of my social contact at the time. These were my friends, even though they still have no idea who I am. There is a wealth of content creators that cover Warhammer, and sometimes having them on the background really feels like you're part of the conversation. That's kind of nice. Different people will have different approaches and experiences with each of these aspects. It is absolutely fine if you like one but not the others. So maybe you just want to play games and aren't interested in painting. Maybe you enjoy painting but aren't particularly interested in playing, and that's fine too. It's also totally fine to enjoy Warhammer without going near a single miniature. Maybe you just enjoy reading Black Library books and playing Warhammer computer games. You get to do Warhammer your own way. There are also people who paint the miniatures they have before they buy more. Obviously, those people are psychopaths. That kind of behavior is dangerous because, as we all know, if you accidentally paint all of your backlog, then you will die. That is a fact. This is a great hobby with numerous benefits. It really fits well into modern life, and it can be a really satisfying pastime. Not all sunshine and rainbows, though. Games Workshop are in the business of making money. A quick flick through YouTube, and you'll find half a dozen videos posted on any particular day talking about Games Workshop screwing over players. Whether that's another big price increase, some dumb rules issue that wasn't properly playtested, mistreatment of their staff, or even just casual neglect of a faction not getting any updates for a decade. Games Workshop is a hugely successful company, and like all big companies, its primary motivation is to make more money. If you look at the board of directors, you'll see lots of accountants and solicitors, not so many creatives, so the decision from the top will always be on maximizing profit. GW isn't a monolith though, it's made up of all sorts. I've already mentioned Nick and Wade, who are still with GW. There are also tons of people within the company dedicated to making Warhammer as fun as possible, because it's something they love and enjoy. So there's constantly this tension within the company between a focus on making money and a desire to just make good content. Sometimes those things align. I suspect Dan Abnett is let write whatever he wants because they know it'll sell. On the other hand, we've heard some crazy stories like playtesting happening during lunch breaks because management decided it didn't really add any value. The real question here, though, is why we don't all just pack up and move our hobby over to somewhere a big company can't take advantage of us. There are plenty of rule sets out there that are arguably better than anything GW produces. The 3D printing industry has really kicked off over the last decade, and you can print models at home that rival even the best Games Workshop miniatures. Indeed, for a good while, GW was in the bad books. During the late 2000s and early 2010s, Games Workshop had a very insular approach, only interested in selling models and less in engaging with its customers. Game lines were cut, there was no social media presence, and the rules seemed to be more to sell models than actually to have a fun game. Luckily, they reversed that course somewhat in 2015 when the CEO changed, and these days GW has a better understanding of what their customers want, even if they are still very focused on making money. So let's talk about why players are sticking with Games Workshop. A phrase that has gained a lot of popularity lately due to Dungeons & Dragons is network externality. This is an economic term that describes how the value of a product increases as more people use it. Typically, it's applied to social network sites. So if all your friends are on Facebook, then Facebook's probably kind of useful for you. But if none of your friends are, then it's not really worth it. Similarly, in gaming, we have Magic, Dungeons & Dragons, and Warhammer. If you want to play a card game, there are games much better than Magic. But if you randomly pop into a gaming store anywhere in the world, you've got a pretty good chance of finding someone else playing Magic. Same with role-playing games. D&D is the most popular role-playing game in the world because it's the most popular role-playing game in the world. The logic sounds circular, but it does actually make sense. Warhammer is the same. If you're looking to play a war game, then your best bet is to play a Games Workshop game, as they are well supported and you've got a good chance of finding someone else to play with. A better word for this, of course, is community. Like any community, the Warhammer community has its ups and downs, but it's a community and you can be part of it. Whether that's having discussions about a point of lore in one of the Discords, laughing along with the painting phase when they do their weekly chat, or following along one of the painting guides like Mediocre Hobbies or Duncan's Two Tin Cuts. If you're starting brand new into one of these games, putting together a new army or a new team can look like a massive endeavour. If you've been in the hobby for a while though, you'll have built up a collection that you can draw on. Chances are you'll be excited by whatever new thing is coming out, but when that Intercessor team for Kill Team went up, you probably already had the models. Whether they were painted and ready to go, or still in the original box, somewhere in the back of the cabinet. One of the great things about Warhammer is how old products are still supported. So even if you don't have the most up-to-date Cadian models that recently came out, your 20-year-old Cadian shock troops will still get the job done. It might be that you've got an old army or two that you occasionally add to, or it might mean that you've got lots of bits and pieces from all over factions. GW has been around for years, and it's a safe assumption that it'll be around for years to come. Over the years, there have been plenty of war games that have come and gone, and while you could use some of their miniatures in other games, it's hard to find anything as lasting as Warhammer. Because this is all supported, you've already got your foot in the door, and at absolute worst, you just play what you have and don't worry about purchasing new models. This is exactly what happened with Blood Bowl. For years, Games Workshop didn't support it, and instead fans kept the game alive, refining the rules and making their own miniatures. It is great that GW are supporting the game again, and the new edition is really good. But it does go to show how Warhammer and GW are not always the same thing. Indeed, this is somewhat of a cautionary tale for Games Workshop. We don't actually need them. In the years without GW, Blood Bowl actually massively improved, because the team who took on the rules were interested in making the best game they could rather than just money. If you're a new player, give this some thought next time you're planning a purchase. If you're thinking about picking up the new Astra Militarum army, maybe just get a box of Cadian shock troops and consider the army a long-term project, rather than rushing into a big army and burning out early. Similarly, consider your terrain. Each piece is an investment in your collection. If possible, try get something that works across multiple ranges. We can currently see a good crossover with the Kill Team Galadark, which could happily be used for Necromunda or boarding actions in full scale 40k. Similarly, the weird trees from the current Warcry terrain could easily be from the Ash Wastes or from an alien world. In the same way your model collection grows, so does your lore knowledge. I think Warhammer has more in common with Marvel than it does with Star Wars. Luton, one of the big lore YouTube channels, made the case that there really isn't a main character in Warhammer. Unlike with Star Wars, where you mostly follow the Skywalker story, Warhammer has all of these unconnected stories that make up a whole, like you do with the various Marvel comics. You might have read a different collection of books to the ones I have, so you end up with your own personal perspective on the universe, and there's always more out there to explore. As you get deeper, you'll catch more and more of the references, and the story team do a pretty good job of leaving questions unanswered, so the fans can speculate wildly. Another aspect of the lore that's important is the distinct factions there are. People are hardwired to make connections and be part of a group, and the factions in-game play on that. Most fans have a favourite 40k faction and often a favourite sub-faction, like a Space Marine chapter or an Eldar craft world. You probably have your own favourite fantasy army, and that might be different for Age of Sigmar and the Old World. At some point, that moves beyond a faction you like to a faction you play, till eventually it becomes part of who you are. That's not to suggest Chaos fans suddenly become evil bad guys, or Dwarf fans suddenly develop an affinity for mining. But when you're down the pub, trash talking, you know which side you're on, and when Games Workshop does a big release for your faction, you're likely to spend. So these are some of the reasons we stick with Warhammer. There's a great community, although expensive, the miniatures are often a good investment, the lore is deep and engaging, and we often become attached to a particular faction. It's important to note at this point that Games Workshop is not Warhammer. You can quite happily Warhammer away for years without ever making a Games Workshop purchase. For many of us, that could be because we've already got a big backlog, but for new players, that might mean picking up affordable miniatures from another company. You're not going to be able to play those miniatures in the Warhammer world, but most of us don't play games there weekly, so that may not be too much of a problem. It's up to Games Workshop to remain relevant. If they completely screw up the rules for 10th edition of 40k, then there's a good chance players just won't play it. Maybe we'll stick to an old edition, or we'll focus on another game instead. There is a lot of leeway here. Personally, I'm not a fan of the current rules of 40k, which is why I focus on skirmish games instead. But enough players still play 40k that it remains one of GW's most profitable ranges. That only goes so far though. Games Workshop uses various techniques to sell product, and recognizing those can be a big help in understanding whether it's worth your while to purchase or not. Obviously, that's easier said than done, especially when we have limited releases that go up on a Saturday morning and are sold out in a few minutes. Even if you're not getting some limited special edition, Games Workshop products are very expensive, so it is important that we understand how to get the best value out of that. I recently picked up the Crimson Court Underworlds warband with the plan of getting them painted for a Warcry project. So I very much enjoyed seeing updates of Darren Latham, who has been working on Prince Duval from that box. Darren is an amazing GW painter, and he's been doing 10 steps for just red armor. For some models, I'm happy to just blast through with some contrast to get them on the table as soon as possible, but for these miniatures, I think I might try push myself and follow Darren's recipe as much as possible. That doesn't change the value of the model per se, especially as painting a model usually devalues it, but it will mean I will be spending more time on it. So for me, it kind of increased the value. And this is kind of the community element that I was talking about earlier. Now, this isn't to justify Games Workshop's pricing strategy, which essentially boils down to how much blood can they squeeze from us. But there are elements that can increase the personal value. That Darren's painting the same model and posting about it is a big help for me. That he uses GW paints makes it more likely that I'll stick to the Citadel paint range. After I paint the model, I'll be able to share it using the #Warhammer community tag so other Warhammer fans will see it. Although I could use a different company's model, I'll be able to turn up in my local store and my opponent will recognize the model straight away. A few years down the line, if I decide to build an undead army for Age of Sigmar, then I'll have these guys ready to go. Indeed, since I already have the Cursed City box, I might already have the makings for one of those armies. That's why I still Warhammer, even though I know Games Workshop is just interested in the money. I grew up with it, it's got a place in my heart, I love the background, I enjoy games with friends, I value the community aspects, and I find painting relaxing and rewarding. Although I often spend a little bit more than I should, I understand how to get the most value out of the hobby. I've also been collecting for quite a while, so I'm usually not starting a project from scratch, whether that's models or scenery. As an example, this Chaos Jackal is the monthly free miniature from my local GW store. I popped in one evening and had a nice chat with one of the staff there. That was free was actually the least part of its value for me. I've still got tons of miniatures in my backlog, and I've no real plans for this Jackal. He was fun to paint, and when I head back into the store, I'll show him off. I even posted him on Instagram, where I managed to get a few likes. He'll probably sit with my Necromunda collection for a while, until I figure out exactly what to do with him. Could I have done all this with another miniature from another game? Maybe, at least somewhat. But because the Jackal is a Warhammer model, he's part of a greater legacy, stretching back to my youth, and hopefully extending well into my future. Thanks for making it all the way to the end. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Each week I put up a new video talking about one of Games Workshop's specialist games. The goal is always to try and make the best possible two-player experience. If this is something you'd find interesting, please subscribe to the channel and comment to let me know what you'd like to see in future.